Hi, everyone. This is Anastasia, and I'm here today with Renee Collini, and she is an amazing sea level rise expert working in coastal resiliency and adaptation. And we are thrilled to have her talking with us today. Hi, Renee.
Hi, Anastasia. How are you?
Good. It's good to see you again. And thank you so much for speaking at our fall conference on sea level rise. I was just watching the recording of your section just the other day and thinking how much great information is there, and people really need to take advantage of that. So I'm hoping that I can recirculate a lot of that really good fundamental information on sea level rise. But today, actually, we want to circle back and hear more about who you are, how you got into this field, and really sort of the things that you feel are really important about what's going on in the face of all the sea level rise. And I know that you're working in the Gulf, so that is a huge area being impacted. But let's just start by me asking you, what are your thoughts about the new report that just came out from NOAA about with the new figures for sea level rise?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you asked about that. I was fortunate enough to get to review it and help work really closely with some of the authors on that report. And, moving forward in science is necessary. And so I'm glad to see that we're keeping pace and that we're updating. People may not have realized that's actually an update from a report that came out in 2017. And so there's some really interesting things that came out of it. One, that there is a narrower range of what's expected out to 2050. And so it's just nice knowing that when we're thinking about the near term, it isn't like a big range we have to think about. Something else that was really interesting about this report is that it was accompanied, when we're talking about that near term, with observation data that they extended or extrapolated out. So they looked at not only the rate of sea level rise, like how much has happened, but also how quickly is it changing? How fast is it accelerating? And they took that together and extrapolated forward in time out to 2050. And so it just sort of gives an additional line of evidence, like, oh, with modeling, we see this projected. And then if we extend our observing data from those tide gauges, which we all use all the time, we see very similar trends. And so it helps understand in the near term, we actually really do have a good sense of what's going to happen. So from a planning perspective, a resilience perspective, that was huge for me. The other thing is that seeing moving out, forward beyond 2050, the range is still fairly large. But again, we had updates to those exceedance probabilities. There was updates to the science that built that modeling, so we can still feel better about that sort of range of what we're looking at as being what's possible, and thinking about our own risks and how we want to plan within that. So all of those things are really good. One thing I will say, there was also those, they called them extreme water levels, which I thought was kind of confusing because it's not all that extreme, right? Some of those water levels they were talking about was 10 times a year, which is common, not extreme. But when they talked about those, what they saw is that even if we only have a moderate amount, to a small amount of sea level rise over the next 30 years, in that time frame, we do expect a shift in sort of our flood regimes, the patterns we see, the frequencies we're seeing flooding. And so even though it's some good news and that we have a little more time before we see some of those big numbers, right? They took the extreme sea level rise curve out and stuff like that. There is still a clear pressing need to get moving on some of this. So I thought it was a lot of actionable science. Just a note, I feel like I'm going on and on, but I just wanted to quickly say, we are actually actively working right now, me and a team of other extension and outreach specialists from NOAA and Sea Grants and from other places, on a companion piece. It's an application guide that'll help provide guidance to understand some of that science, but specifically how to think about it for applying that science moving forward.
That's great, because that is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. You are such a cool person. I love this intersection that you're working in, because it's really the most important thing at this point. I mean, everybody sees that roads are getting flooded. Everybody has seen report after report coming in, but our communities are still struggling with how to understand this, how to, plan for it, what to think about risks, and mostly how to adapt, funding and stuff like that. So I just love to, get your high level first of all, just a description of what you're doing in that area. So what you personally are doing and how you see yourself being most effective, and maybe some of the challenges you're running into.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, the way I sort of feel like I plug in or I can contribute to teams is bringing this sort of actionable knowledge out of all the different resources that exist. And some of that are the curves, right? The new projections of sea level rise, but some of it is about other types of science that we're seeing, whether that's, information about how storm surge is expected to change, but we're also having a lot of advancements on the social science side, better understanding cost benefit analyses and how they help us and sometimes what their drawbacks are, and frameworks for how to engage in resilience or how to think about planning, whether that's using adaptation pathways, which I kind of talked about in that talk, or if we're touching on, say, there's a framework called RAD, which is just fun because the name is RAD, but it's how do you strategically think about like resisting, accepting, and directing changes from rising seas. And that's a DOI actually initiative. But the point is we need to think about how to operationalize all this information. We're learning so much about the process, about the physical changes, about the social changes. And so my contribution to teams, I think, is just to help bring some of that relevant information and plug it into whatever people are trying to accomplish, whether that's a comprehensive plan for a city, or if it's a engineering design for a new wastewater treatment plant, whatever that may look like. Trying to help meet people where they are and bring the information that they're most in need of. And sometimes they don't even know what that gap is, but I've got it's like I drink out of the fire hose and then I try and pour out little bits for everybody.
That's great. So what do you think are the main challenges that you're running into as you're working on these? It sounds like pretty much one-on-one projects where you're helping some particular group with a challenge that they have.
Yeah, often it is that. I do spend quite a bit of time these days sort of training the trainers, if you will. Other extension outreach professionals are also who maybe have different focuses, right? Like say somebody's really focused on a specific county and they're worried about a broad range of things in the county, or say someone typically works on, clean marinas. All of those things can be influenced in some way by sea level rise. And so helping other extension and outreach professionals have the skills to talk about this and how to pull the relevant information for individual efforts is actually something I've been doing. But the challenge is this topic is ramping up, right? And so for 8 years, I've sort of been like pushing this boulder uphill of like, let's talk about changing flood risk. And now suddenly we're on the other side of the hill and that boulder's taken off. And there's just not enough people on the ground ready to talk about this who have the practical skills. And so really just, communities and cities in particular and towns, they're just already overworked. One person has taken on 6 different jobs, and these people are powerhouses, but there's also only so much one individual can do. And so expanding our capacity to address and adapt on the ground to these issues, I think, is one of the biggest challenges. Is we just need more people. Like we have this infrastructure bill coming down, and that's great that there'll be money to implement the projects. It's not going to be enough money because it's never enough money. But one thing that doesn't explicitly address is the fact that we also need to build out people infrastructure.
And we're seeing that even in our work with trying to get these hyperlocal tide stations installed. It's like there are just not enough people to get these projects even up and running, and everybody's got too much on their plate who is already working on this. So tell me a bit about the people that you're working with, the kind of people that you see coming into the field, the kind of issues that you're seeing in terms of literally this, really, it's a human resource that we're talking about right now.
We're growing it as much as we can. Like I said, I'm training folks and I'm growing my team as quickly as I can as well. But I think that people who are coming into this sector often are people who maybe wouldn't have pegged themselves as being in this sector to begin with. So for example, there's a guy, I talk about him all the time because it's just so incredible. He's the engineering lead for a utility authority in Mississippi. And he's at the forefront of like tackling these issues. And so, a lot of times it's like the challenges are data gaps for him, right? Like, what is the cost benefit of building a berm taller? What's the cost benefit of building a berm around my new facility at all? Where do I have information about the intersection of like sea level rise impacts and septic tanks in the region? those kind of things didn't exist. And so him and I had to get creative and pull in some partners and figure out where the septic tanks are and which ones are at risk to sea level rise. And so that's just one example, but I think sometimes there's this idea that the people who are working on resilience are a chief resilience officer in a city or somebody who's installing massive pumps in Miami. And the reality is it's a lot of this, right? It's backflow preventers to keep stormwater from coming in our system, or keeping tidewater from coming in our stormwater systems, or it's thinking about, say, if we're doing a plan, right? And Pensacola right now the city of Pensacola, Florida did a great resilience plan. And they looked at like the compounding effects of like higher tide at the same time as like a strong wind event. And so that was a great first step. And they're already coming back to the table and being like, okay, now we need to think about social vulnerability. And now we need to think about our areas of interest and get more specific about stormwater and building on it. And so I think that the people who are here often are people who have either learned this over the years or have seen the writing on the wall and been like, my job is getting harder. I need to, I need to get ahead of these changes. And so seeing the human capital capacity that's there is really coming from people who are on the ground, just trying to think about these issues in their everyday jobs. And I think we definitely need more of that too.
What do you think the role and responsibility of municipal leaders, and let's not talk about giant cities, but just like, smaller coastal communities, what do you think their role is in this? And what would you wish to see happen for them?
So I guess when you say municipal leaders, that can be a whole bunch of different people, right? It can be elected officials, it can be city staff, it can be leaders within the community that lead in a municipality, whether they're a church leader or a civic group. I will say there is a mayor in a small town in Alabama, Dauphin Island, who I actually today was telling him, I was like, man, I would walk through fire with you to address these issues, because he has such an amazing practical approach to the fact that, he is a mayor of a town on a barrier island. And there are so many complex issues with that reality. And he is doing literally everything that he can to get ahead of the challenges, because the challenges aren't just sea level rise, right? Like we talked about, the challenge is that he's dealing with storm surge, and when the next storm as big as Katrina comes, and he's dealing with the fact that rainwater now isn't draining as well as it used to, and the fact that there's more development because it's a tiny, cozy little town on the coast, and people are trying to get away from big cities, and so the development happens and you have more rainwater issues. But at the same time, on the island, there are more services than there ever have been before because of this introduction of funds. And walking this balance, and the fact that the reality is, that island is not going to be underwater tomorrow. There is some time to think about how to strategically adapt and relocate and realign what the coasts look like. And so he has done an incredible job of like, I'll take all the information you got, we're going to get it in front of the people, and we're going to have some conversations, and he doesn't try and force his opinion, but he does act as a leader to foster conversations about things that as a community they could creatively pursue. So if you're asking what I wish every municipal leader would look like, that's him, Jeff Collier. But, I think just in the reality is, when we're talking about a leader, whoever it is at a municipal level, elected or staff or whatever, I think it's just making sure that, you're setting expectations. No one can wave a magic wand and make everything come together or have all the things they need, but taking advantage of the opportunities when they come up and trying to think strategically. I mean, again, I can name people all day that work on the Northern Gulf Coast to do phenomenal jobs of reaching out of their own department or out of their own silo to engage other people, even in their cities. So yeah, I'm not going to keep listing people, but I think there are already some great examples in our region of how it really does become about just talking to other people and thinking creatively.
It's interesting that sea level rise for our coastal communities is really bringing us together in a new way that we haven't had to face before, and seriously creating some cross communication from groups that don't totally communicate. It sounds like you're very comfortable in that space. I'm wondering, what is it about your background or who you are that actually makes you so comfortable in this in-between space, a nexus type of space?
Yeah, I think, well, I always have a joke that I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. And so
Not true.
I feel like that's helpful, right? Because sea level rise touches everything. But I think the other thing is I'm not uncomfortable with conflict. I think people hear conflict and they think immediately that it's negative, but the spaces where we don't understand each other is where we grow and learn. And so having those conversations, to me, it's kind of like, what's the alternative, right? We have to come together and we have to learn how to talk each other's languages. And the role of translators, I've always had honestly an interest in language, whether that was learning Spanish or learning how to speak science as fluently as I can speak planner. But someone has to have that role. And I feel like I'm comfortable in those spaces where we have to sort of work through things and figure out, oh, actually, we are saying the same thing, just in different ways. This topic is hard, and not everyone's going to come together and sing Kumbaya, and there's reasons for that. And so trying to find common ground, I think, is a fun challenge. It's a puzzle. We're trying to figure out the creative ways to make everything fit together. So I really like it. And then, of course, there's just the reality that I came up in technical support, marine technical support. So I used to service tide stations. I ran a real-time observing network. And it's the same question, right? It's like, okay, how much money can we get to support these instruments and which ones are the most important? And then how do we make sure that's getting to the right people and having conversations with different groups who want different things? It's all just about sort of like that ability to actively listen and then find that common ground. The joke, of course, is that I bartended and served for a decade. And if you can't figure out what you have in common with somebody, with every person, you're not going to get paid.
That's a great point. So just thinking about the mindset. So let's talk about the mindset of a planner versus the mindset of a scientist. Do you see a big difference in the way people conceive of the world in those two views?
Oh, absolutely. That's kind of the fun part, right? Like a researcher, their timelines, their focus, their interest is it's an inch wide and a mile deep on a topic, right? And they're passionate about that thing and they have questions about that thing. Whereas a planner is having to think about, okay, tomorrow and maybe next week. And if they're lucky, they get to think about a 5-year strategic plan. But a community planner has to be responsive to a lot of different things that they don't have a lot of, charge of. And they have to think an inch deep and a mile wide. They've got to think about everything that's happening in a city. And so right off the bat, you sort of have different timelines, you have different interest levels on different topics. And in terms of who has agency over what pieces of a conversation, that looks very different. One of the things I actually try really hard to do when we're conceiving of research projects, okay, like where do we need to go research next, is to make sure that those planners or the floodplain managers or the natural resource managers are in that space setting that question so that whatever does come out from the other end is something they can use.
So then that brings us to the other very important aspect. Of course, there's the planners, there's the scientists, but let's talk about the public. So what is your thought about how to maximize, or what experience have you had in terms of maximize effective communication about these issues and help the public understand and empower the public to taking action on these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. For my group in particular, it's one we've actually been actively exploring more recently. So, I like to just ask people what they need. And so when I was asking my partners, often their times they're municipal employees or their state natural resource managers, they said, I can't keep being the only one talking about this. There's often one champion as a municipal leader who's really pushing about flood risk and sea level rise and these topics. And they're like, I can't keep being the one at every meeting who brings it up because people are just going to start to tune me out, or they already have tuned me out, and we were like, okay, well, if we need more people talking about it, we can bring experts in, but that's not the same as having people in an area care about an issue. And simultaneously, we have literature that's been coming out that shows resilience in general and sustainability requires sort of a salience of the issues among a community for action to really move forward successfully. And so something we're trying is we've always done what are called community connection dialogues or something like that, where it's informal. We bring pizza, or sometimes we'll do it at like a brew pub or whatever. And we've got a couple of videos and like 5-minute videos, and we'll show them and then we'll ask people, what are your questions? What didn't make sense to you about these changes that are coming? What are your concerns? And then we actively have conversations. And again, we have a couple of case study videos of what communities can do. What does success even look like when we're talking about resilience? And what can you do with a relatively small amount of money, and answer questions. And so the spin is that now we're going to do that in a way where we bring the municipal official, that champion, to the meeting. And so then the next step of that conversation is, well, here's the science, help people get past any either underestimation of risk or overestimation of risk. And then 2, here's what can be done about it. And then 3, here's what your city officials or your city leaders are trying to do right now, or here's what's on the horizon, so that the people in those rooms who want to learn already have the information and know which direction to push with that information, or where to go, or how to contribute. And then simultaneously, we are training those folks to then go and do what we're calling pop-ins. And so we're going to leave them all the supplies to do this. We're going to do a couple with them, but you go to like a Walmart parking lot, a ball game, right? An art festival, not like an Earth Day celebration, like a place where somebody didn't know they were going to learn about flood risk. And we have these games we've developed, right? And a little bit of virtual reality. And so it's, what in 5 minutes can you do? Not to make somebody walking by an expert, but what kind of game or activity can you do to just raise awareness that there's change in flood risk and it could impact them? And so then we're reaching the people who want to learn more and the people who may not realize they want to learn more. And we're leaving that in the hands of other people in that community so that they can keep having that conversation after we've left. Because I work across 3 states, so I'm never going to be able to be at every church bazaar. We've got to make sure other people are able to have these conversations. And we actually have brought in, so I'm with Mississippi State University Extension. And so we brought in a colleague who specializes on evaluation of projects like this, like program evaluation. Her name's Donna Peterson. And so Donna's actually going to do an external review to see if it's helpful. She's going to do follow-up after 6 months. She'll do evaluations right then and there to see, like, okay, did we have a change in knowledge? Are people doing things differently 6 months later? So we think this is a great strategy. It's been effective. At least we know, reaching people who want to know. And so just sort of this expansion, we're excited to see if this really does meet the need. We think it will. Obviously, we wouldn't have pursued it, but we're excited to get some outside confirmation or guidance if it doesn't work, how we could do it better.
I'm just curious, did you you had the stakeholder who was interested and they were the one who sort of became that local sponsor? Is that how it worked for those programs? And then you guys sort of did the mounting of the program and worked with them?
Yeah, and it's really just starting, but yeah, so we identified both a municipal partner and like a community or civic partner. So for example, we're going to do this work in Santa Rosa County, Florida. And so in Santa Rosa, the county itself is on board. They're going to send some people to those meetings, the community connection dialogues. And then we're working with the Pensacola and Perdido Bay's estuary program as our community group. And so the staff will get trained on the pop-ins, but also their members that are part of their group are going to get trained. Mm-hmm. And so then they'll be able to persist that with the pop-ins. So that's just one example. We're working with 12 different communities across the Northern Gulf, and we're still looking for 6 more if anybody's interested in listening.
Well, we'll definitely get the word out. If send us something written and we'll make sure we get the word out, because that would be terrific. We're really always looking to support these kinds of efforts. So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you even get into all of this besides bartending, and the ocean stuff and the science, and how did you arrive here?
Yeah. So, I got my master's in marine science. And before that, I got a bachelor's in biology because I was worried that marine science was kind of a lark. And so I wanted something practical to fall back on in case it didn't work out. But, I was young and I was like, well, I'll just give it a try. I'll spend a couple of years getting my master's degree. And in that, I learned a lot about biophysical interactions, how the world interacts with itself and how that may influence things. And I thought it was so fascinating. But getting that to an applied place to see the science get used there was a disconnect, and I just wanted to see something more applied. And so I was offered this job doing marine technical support, where I was helping a whole bunch of projects get done. But the main thing was this observing network. And a big part of that was helping to translate the data and help it get used, whether that was the Alabama Public Health Department, or if that was the bar pilots bringing ships in and out. You're familiar with all the range of ways this data can be used. And in doing that, I got connected with Sea Grant, and this opportunity to work on sea level rise came up. And at first it was just a part-time position. So I was doing the 2 jobs. And I really fell in love with resilience. Nobody was talking about sea level rise back then anyways. But this idea that we could not only take science and help it be applied, but really at all these different scales and all these different ways. And it was hard because people didn't necessarily want to talk about it. And I like a challenge, apparently, whether it's monitoring or sea level rise, I pick underdogs. But it just really grew for me. And so then it became a full-time gig in 2016. And I've just always, I've loved it ever since.
And as a child, were you enamored with the ocean? I mean, is that a lifelong view?
Yeah, no, it makes no sense. I grew up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. So, I say that like Alabama's a coastal state, Florida's a coastal state, Texas is a state that happens to have a coast. So that far inland, we do not have that connection. But from like second grade on, I always said, I want to be a marine scientist, I want to be a marine biologist. My mother had no idea where that idea came from, but it got locked in. And actually I had a friend of the family who was a marine scientist and actively tried to talk me out of it until I started grad school. And then he like switched and he was my biggest champion. And I was like, what the heck? And he was like, well, if someone telling you it was a bad idea was enough to deter you, you weren't going to be able to handle it. But since you clearly are stubborn enough to push through that, I think you'll be okay. And I mean, he was right. This is a labor of love for sure. But from the beginning, I have definitely wanted to live near the water, despite having no experience with it whatsoever.
The siren call of the ocean is a profound one for sure. Let me ask you a little bit about something. I just was reading in an article today about the new report that came out from the UN, is IPCC, right? On the climate change. And I was reading a bit, this article about some of the scientists in that, and they were expressing their frustration about years and years of report after report after report coming out and talking about their burnout and general depression that's happening around for scientists working in climate change. And I was curious to get your opinion about it. I know it's kind of a downer subject, but I think it's an important subject.
It's a very important subject, and across the climate enterprise is kind of what we call it. Whether it's the science or the services to science or them acting on the science, there is this overall greater risk for depression. And I actually saw a great quote today where basically climate change is this very sort of slippery slope where you can simultaneously feel like your actions are making it worse, but there's nothing you can do that's big enough to make it better. And I think that that's common. And for me and for my team, it's something we keep trying to talk about, right? And make sure we're upfront about not only the fact that that's a risk, that climate change is a hard thing to work on, but also to remember to celebrate the wins. And I think that is one thing that makes my job so much less susceptible sometimes, I think, to that. I mean, don't get me wrong, it can be exhausting to see, especially when you're working in some communities where we're so far from where we should be at all, much less being ready for climate change or sea level rise even. But I get to work on the ground with people and see with my very own eyes the changes. I have seen the change in the conversation. I mean, I get requests like once a week for data now. That was not happening in 2016. That was not happening in 2014. And so I can feel the groundswell. I'm part of it. I can see it changing. I think when you're doing the research, you're so many levels removed from those changes, and all you're really aware of is sort of that like esoteric policy level. I think that makes it a little worse, especially for some of these brilliant scientists who are just stuck behind their computer models, doing this work, trying to save the world. I get to see like when we make these changes, like I get to see the numbers when we find out that after we did a curriculum on sea level rise, 6 months later, those students are participating in more activities and they are talking about sea level rise to their parents more often, right? I get to see that after I did a lunch and learn with consultants, 6 months later, 60% of them have talked about sea level rise and used that science. Like it's not, I mean, we call them small wins, but it's not small wins. How many of those projects wouldn't have been as resilient as they are now? So I think I get to be closer to the action, and that helps a lot.
That's great. And, I'm wondering if there might be some lessons for all of the educators, because we have a lot of educators reaching out to us about the tide data that we're collecting and how they and their students can use it. And I was I was wondering, you've had some experience with students and, in terms of messaging to young people, I mean, it's tricky, right? I mean, we want them to feel like they have a bit of agency. And what do you recommend for people?
So for educators, first, I'm just going to recommend a person. Her name is Sonia Vedral. She actually led the development of a curriculum of a team of people who contributed, but on Sea Level Rise for high school students. And that curriculum has some on the science, right, and the changes, but the rest of it, so 3 out of 4 modules, is focused on what can be done. And we do talk about in that, like a community level, an individual level, right, a larger level. And we talk about natural solutions. So like we have students go out and find a way to make a rain garden on their campus, and again, it comes back to that idea of like thinking about like, okay, well, that's that much less water that's going to end up in a system that ends up flooding somebody, And then we also have them go through an exercise at the end of that, like a capstone project, where they build their own resilience plan for a fictional town. And so they get to see firsthand that they do have the skills to think about these complex topics. And just a plug, like in that curriculum, we found some innovative ways. We're already upgrading to include the new report and this new tool that's out from NOAA, where you can look at the tide stations and make a threshold and see how that changes over time. It's a really great tool, both practical use, but also education. So that'll be in the new upcoming versions. But you just got to make sure that it's real, that you're using real data, you're showing students that these things are happening and that those actions are really happening and that they can be a part of that. And they don't have to wait until they graduate college.
So yeah, just giving some action and some forward-looking thing, not just sitting with the terrible messaging that we're all wondering what to do with.
Yep, we have a lot of like field trips too, where it's not, and we did this thing, and anybody can do this. I'm telling you, like the municipal officials want to talk about this. They like sharing about the good work they're doing. And so we have connected these teachers with resilience professionals, whether it's those planners, it's civic leaders, whoever, so that they can talk about their role and what they do, so students can get a sense of all the different jobs out there, other than being a scientist, about how to tackle these issues. So that's something too we found that students really seem to like.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's adding a whole new view to what kids think is possible in the world these days, right? And that is just incredibly important. And of course, these kind of positions never existed before. So these are really valid positions, which is another really, really cool thing. So one other thing that I was curious about is the social justice and inequity issues around sea level rise. Can you speak a little bit about your experience with that in the Gulf?
Yeah, it's a very pressing topic in the Gulf. Overall, there's sort of less wealth in certain ways. If you look at the distribution across the country, we have a lot of concentration of low income and people below the poverty line sort of across the Gulf. And if you look at some of the literature, for example, a study that was done in 2013, it shows that if we don't start to take some proactive steps now, there'll be a lot of people displaced. The thing is, it doesn't have to look like that it means that we need to start working now. And a critical part about when we talk about like systemic sort of barriers is that right now, the people who are able to get money for adaptation and who are able to get money for planning and mitigation, those are people who already have the capacity to do it. And so with each passing grant cycle, we are further exacerbating the differences in people who have capacity and the ability to respond and those who don't. And so that is something where we need to take a look at ourselves. This is not work that can be done or should be done by people in underserved communities or historically marginalized communities. This is work that we need to do to fix the system so that we are supporting everybody and not just people who already are able to support themselves. And this is, from the federal level on down, even at the municipal level, right? Think about when you're having public meetings or how you're getting information about what's at risk. Who's able to come to those meetings? Do you have public transportation? Do you have childcare? Is dinner going to be served, right? And all the way up to the federal level where you have to be able to write and manage grant money. That's a serious skill that takes a long time to craft. Let me tell you, I've been working on it for over a decade. It's tough. And so, you can't expect a community that's barely able to function in other ways or that's overworked or overburdened to then also have that additional capacity. There's a whole, I mean, that could be an hour and a half long topic by itself, days worth topic by itself, but there are some really great people doing work on this in the Gulf. And I think one of the most critical things when we talk about sea level rise is remembering that sea level rise resilience is not just about physical safety from flooding, that it is really about the adaptive capacity, which means, money, means, the ability to move, the ability to respond, to absorb damages. Can you get to work that day? Who can't get to work that day, right? Like if someone is already overstressed or overburdened by things, like just trying to figure out how to get food on the table that day, or they can't get to work because their car broke down, like these added challenges can't really take the forefront. And so I think it just, it's complex and it takes time. And there are a lot of people who are working on community development or community redevelopment in the Gulf, and recognizing that that is part of sea level rise resilience too.
We would love to be able to support that work too, in what we're doing, just getting the word out.
Just a couple examples from Mississippi. There's this group called the STEPS Coalition that's working closely with the NAACP, that's actively working to help revitalize a part of Biloxi, Mississippi after Katrina, right? They had 56 buildings on this main street. It was an active, hub of commerce and culture. And there's 11 still today. And Katrina happened in 2005. And so they're working not only to rebuild the community with the community, but also to be thinking about, okay, well, how do we rebuild in a way that it's still going to be here after the next storm? So that's one. And then another colleague, actually a little bit farther to the west, Catherine Egland, who's working with a group called ECHO. I mean, her capacity, it's crazy. She'll work at these local, hyperlocal levels on a neighborhood called, Turkey Creek or Forest Heights and Gulfport, to try and address flooding issues there and the relationship it has to that broader issue of community development and agency, all the way up to international levels, where she's going to the COPs and she's able, like the COPs, for the climate work, and she's able to go and talk to people about like the wood burning pellets and stuff. It's just, she works at all these different levels. And again, tackling this interconnectedness between what is climate resilience with what does it mean to be socially resilient.
That's great. I'm definitely going to look up their work and would love to get down there to the Gulf, because it's obvious that you guys are really ahead of almost all the areas in the United States. And I'm quite frightened when I talk to municipal leaders here in the Northeast about how far away we are even from considering some of these things. So you guys...
I'm talking about my favorites. I mean, I'm not saying the whole Gulf looks like this, but yeah, I'm definitely, the thing I like about the Gulf is sometimes we stop asking questions about why, and we just sort of roll up our sleeves and deal with our reality.
It's, let's get practical at this point. And I think that is one of the big messages coming out of everything at this point. We've had enough reports. We don't have enough data, but we understand where we need data and what kind of data we need. And that is super empowering. And we are so grateful to have people like you working on great issues like this, and with such an ecology of mind and connections with these things. It's not just about one issue. It touches everybody really in different ways. So it's really well. Renee, do you have any questions for me, or anything further that you would like to say on this? Or
well, I think I've talked enough. I do really appreciate the fact that you're raising awareness here. And I mean, the programming you put on earlier and just this continued dialogue, I think helping just to get the word out is, Catherine Hayhoe says this all the time. The number one thing we can do about these issues is talk about it. So what is it? Something like 67% of the US is concerned, but less than a third of them actually talk about it. Imagine what a difference we could make if we all just start talking about it a little more.
Yeah, it's funny. The Tide Station project that we have going on, that we're trying to really get as many places as possible. Of course, having the data locally is so important, but it's the public awareness and the dialogue that happens around actually owning your own data. This is my place, this is my town, this is my data. it's not, what Noah, who those scientists, I don't even know who they are, say it's going on here, it's mine. And I think that to me is super important part of the whole thing, is to have, a connection, a literal connection with the water levels where you are, and that ownership. So that for me has been a big thing. But if you had a message or two that you really wanted to get out to the world right now, what would that be?
Like I like to say, we're not going to be underwater tomorrow, but the longer we wait to have conversations and to make choices and to figure out how we want to live with the water changing, the less choice we get to have. If we start making these decisions now and start having these conversations now, we have the time and space to choose the cities, the communities, the cultures, the economies we want to have in the next 30 to 50 years. But every day, every month, every year that we wait to have those conversations, we have a little less time. And that means we have a little less agency over our own destiny with this.
I am overdue to get down to the South and see all these cool projects. I'd love to sit in on one of those community efforts. And I really, really appreciate your time and great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And you're welcome anytime. We'll put on a crawfish boil. You'll love it.
That sounds really fun.